Hello and welcome to a new video on my channel. Today, I'm presenting you with the story, Rainbow Storm. I hope you'll enjoy it. This story contains scenes of brutality, horror, and eroticism. Despite that, I hope you can still appreciate this unique tale full of wonders, superpowers, and tragedies. So, without further ado, let's dive straight into the story. Frank is a well-known historian throughout the United States. His parents were wealthy, leaving him a substantial fortune, enough that he would never need to work again if he didn't want to. However, Frank's love for history led him to become a historian, driven by his desire to uncover the mysteries of the past. It's this very desire that fuels him to constantly seek out and unravel new enigmas. As he strolls through the streets of New York City, Frank wonders what the future holds. It is March 29, 2040, and tonight he plans to attend a party. To be honest, he isn't entirely sure why his friend David pushed him into going. It's a party thrown by the super rich, something Frank usually avoids. But in the end, his friend David managed to convince him to indulge a little and attend the event. That afternoon, as the sun stands high in the sky and Frank walks past a small park, he notices a young woman feeding pigeons with breadcrumbs. The woman has blue eyes and short black hair. She wears a black leather jacket and matching leather pants. A cigarette dangles from her lips, and she seems lost as she sits there. Frank might not have noticed her if it weren't for her eyes. There's something about them, something that feels too old for her youthful appearance. He wonders how someone so young could seem so ancient. Her aura is one of sadness and she appears somewhat depressed, but there is something else, something deep within her blue eyes. It strikes Frank as loneliness. But that's not what truly intrigues him. He can't quite put his finger on it, but it feels as though this young woman has lived through eons. Though, of course, this could just be a trick of his imagination. Moved by the sense that she could use some company, Frank approaches her and asks, "Mind if I sit here?" "Do what you want," the young woman replies. "What's your name?" Frank asks. "I've had many names, but most call me Popet, like puppet, or simply the Wanderer," she says, exuding an overwhelming loneliness. When Frank inquires why she's called the Wanderer, she doesn't respond, continuing to feed the pigeons absent-mindedly. Frank closes his eyes and tilts his head back, allowing the sun to warm his face. He wonders if there's anything he could ask to draw her out. He's curious about her story. In that moment, he can't help but remember how his parents used to say he often seemed like a dreamer. He doesn't mind that perception, in fact, he finds it comforting. To him, dreams are what make the world magical. "What's making you smile?" Popet asks. "Nothing much, just remembering how my parents used to call me a dreamer," Frank replies, amused. "Well, that's interesting. I wouldn't have guessed that the renowned historian Frank Green was once a dreamer too, just like today," Popet remarks. "So, you know who I am," Frank says. "Yes, I do. I've read some of your work over the years when I was bored. If I were you, though, I wouldn't go to that party tonight. Instead, I'd stock up on supplies," Popet advises. "What do you mean by that? It's not like a famine is about to strike anytime soon," Frank says. "But it will happen, and I don't say this lightly, I know it, but I can see that I probably won't be able to convince you. It's a shame, really, that all of this will soon come to an end. It feels a bit like the calm before the storm," Popet says, standing up. As she does, the pigeons scatter in every direction. She puts the rest of her bread into her backpack and closes it. She lingers for a moment, looking at Frank with a distant expression, as though lost in her thoughts. "Perhaps we'll meet again, but for your sake, it might be better if we don't. By the way, I find your podcasts really interesting, Frank Green. The way you talk about the past, it's almost as if I was really there," Popet says, her voice stiff. The coldness and loneliness that gleams in her eyes leaves Frank with a heavy feeling, a sense that he didn't find the right words to connect with her. He would have liked to ask her more questions, but he isn't sure how to approach them. "Why do you seem so lonely?" Frank asks. "Why, that's a good question. Maybe it's because everything passes by so quickly, or maybe it's because so many people I once cared about have died over time," Popet replies, waving a farewell. It isn't until she disappears around a corner of the park that Frank realizes he hadn't mentioned going to a party that evening. This makes him wonder how the young woman with the strange name knew. For a moment, the encounter feels eerie to Frank, but then his phone rings, it's David. Frank answers and hears his old friend saying that he's already waiting for him. Frank frowns, asking why David is already waiting if the party isn't supposed to start until later. In a playful tone, David explains that he wants to wander around the city a bit before the party. Frank considers whether to join him, knowing full well that his friend will likely drag him to some upscale neighborhood. The last time David took him around New York, they ended up in a strip club by the end of the night. Suddenly, Frank remembers that he saw a young woman, either the same one or someone who looked very similar, at that strip club a week ago. Whether this is just a coincidence or connected to the young woman's secrets, Frank can't say. The memory of that wild night is still fresh, especially the image of the woman in her underwear serving food to a wealthy-looking man in a suit. To Frank's surprise, David actually just wanted to show him some of New York's hidden gems and offer a few treats before heading to the party. Frank and David wait on a quiet street for another friend who's supposed to pick them up. This friend arrives in a limousine, throwing the door open with a broad smile. "Hop in, my friends," he calls out, his voice warm and a bit raspy. Frank can't help but smile at the exaggerated antics of his friends. He admits that an event like this party is special, but he's never really been the social type. Yet, as he sits in the car, the young woman's warning echoes in his mind again, and suddenly, he feels uneasy about going to the party. It's as though some deep instinct is telling him that something bad is going to happen. Staring out the car window, Frank watches the sky darken as the sun sets and the air cools. There's nothing unusual in the night sky, but the unsettling feeling lingers. Throughout the drive, Frank has the impression that something fundamental is shifting in the background, something he can't quite grasp. When they arrive at the party, it's already in full swing. The dance floor is packed with people, and others are helping themselves to a lavish buffet. The spread looks expensive, while a soft, rhythmic beat plays in the background. Frank could sense the relaxed atmosphere of the party, yet a part of him simply couldn't unwind. He noticed a young woman with blonde hair and blue eyes making her way to the dance floor. She was wearing a skin-tight red and gold dress that clung to her every curve, moving seductively to the rhythm of the music. Frank found himself questioning how a woman dressed so provocatively had been allowed in, yet there she was, commanding the attention of the crowd with her alluring dance. Frank's eyes scanned the room, and he caught sight of another woman standing nearby, her gaze sharp and calculating as she surveyed the space. Her icy stare and lean, muscular frame seemed out of place at a gathering like this, where people were supposed to be enjoying themselves. Just then, Frank heard a gasp from someone nearby. People were pointing towards the windows, exclaiming that the northern lights were visible. Frank instinctively looked at his watch, it was exactly midnight. A nagging voice in the back of his mind told him that something significant was happening. He joined the growing crowd at the windows, but instead of following them, he made his way to the balcony. Stepping outside, the cool night air brushed against his face. What he saw took his breath away. Across the horizon, vibrant lights in every color of the rainbow danced across the sky. The lights were vast, shimmering with an ethereal beauty that felt almost otherworldly. That unsettling feeling that Frank had been trying to ignore all evening now clawed its way to the forefront of his mind. Something deep within him screamed that these lights weren't normal. Though he wasn't an expert in meteorology, he knew enough to realize that these rainbow-colored auroras couldn't be explained by natural phenomena like geomagnetic storms. Real auroras would look different, he was sure of it. "This is my cue," someone said behind him. Suddenly, gunshots rang out. Chaos erupted as everyone in the room screamed and ducked for cover. Frank spun around to see the woman who had caught his eye earlier standing in the middle of the dance floor, now holding 2 pistols. His heart pounded as adrenaline surged through his veins, fear gripping him. "Listen up, everyone," the woman shouted, her voice cold and commanding. "We're only here for one person. The rest of you just need to stay put for a few minutes, and then we'll be on our way. To make sure everything goes smoothly, drop your phones and gadgets and kick them over to me. Anyone who tries to contact someone outside can imagine what happens next." Terrified, the guests complied, dropping their devices and kicking them across the floor. It was clear that she had only a limited number of bullets, but no one wanted to be the first to find out just how many. "You're all wondering why we're making such a scene," she continued, her voice dripping with menace. "Consider this a warning, don't mess with Twilight." The room grew even quieter, the weight of her words sinking in. Frank had heard stories about Twilight, rumors that anyone who crossed them disappeared without a trace. He had always dismissed those tales as mere urban legends, but now, faced with this terrifying reality, he wasn't so sure. But this situation puzzled him. Why would Twilight, a group known for operating in the shadows, suddenly act so openly? Why would they issue a public warning instead of discreetly eliminating whoever had provoked them? Frank couldn't comprehend what could have driven Twilight to send such a brazen message to the criminal underworld of the USA. As he stood frozen, trying to make sense of it all, a sickening realization began to dawn on him. This night was far from over, and whatever was happening was just beginning. As the party-goers stood frozen in fear, the tension in the room suddenly shifted. The same woman with short blonde hair and blue eyes, who had danced seductively on the dance floor earlier, now appeared at the top of the grand staircase. She was still in her striking red and gold dress, but now it was splattered with blood. Her expression was one of cold determination as she descended the stairs, her heels clicking ominously against the marble. She approached the woman with the pistols, who had been holding the crowd at gunpoint. The blonde woman's presence alone seemed to command authority, and the pistol-wielding woman, though armed and dangerous, became instantly deferential. It was clear who was in charge. "It's done. We can leave now," the blonde woman said calmly, her voice carrying an eerie calmness that sent chills down Frank's spine. Without hesitation, the other woman nodded, holstering her pistols. The two of them walked towards the main entrance with a deliberate and unhurried pace, as if they hadn't just caused chaos. The deference of the muscular, pistol-wielding woman to the smaller blonde was striking. She followed her leader's every move, clearly submissive in her presence. As they exited through the grand front doors, the blonde woman led the way, her posture straight and her steps measured, while the other woman trailed slightly behind, head bowed. The two of them disappeared around the corner of the street, vanishing into the night. It was only after they were gone that the tension in the room finally began to dissipate. The guests slowly began to move, their terror giving way to confusion and relief. Someone finally found the courage to call the police. When the authorities arrived, they combed through the area meticulously, searching for any clues that might lead them to the mysterious women. But despite their efforts, no trace of the intruders could be found. It was as if they had vanished into thin air. Meanwhile, the sky outside continued to shift in a way that seemed almost as ominous as the events inside. The rainbow-colored auroras had spread, now covering a third of the entire sky. Their presence was both beautiful and unsettling, casting a surreal glow over the city. Frank, still shaken by the night's events, eventually made his way back to his apartment. But sleep did not come easily. He lay in bed, staring out the window at the night sky, unable to shake the image of those women from his mind. The auroras had expanded further, now blanketing the entire sky in a mesmerizing display of color. The phenomenon was unlike anything he had ever seen. The auroras didn't simply light up the sky, they seemed to layer it, like countless sheets of light compressed into one. Behind the vibrant colors, Frank could faintly make out the clouds, but they were obscured, as if viewed through a prism. The lights, though expansive and vividly colorful, did not shine brightly. It was as if they were holding back their true brilliance. Whenever Frank glanced away, the lights appeared faint and distant, almost as if they weren't there at all. But when he focused his gaze directly on them, the colors seemed to intensify, glowing with an impossible brightness that defied logic. It was a sight that made no sense, a paradox that left Frank more unsettled the longer he watched. The more he tried to understand it, the less it seemed to follow any natural laws. And as he lay there, the weight of the night pressed down on him, leaving him with the inescapable feeling that something far beyond his comprehension was unfolding right before his eyes. As Frank lay in bed, the events of the night played out in his mind like a relentless reel of unsettling scenes. His thoughts were fraught with fear and confusion, particularly about the strange woman from the party. Her cold, blue eyes seemed oddly familiar, a haunting presence that had unsettled him deeply. Despite the chaotic scene at the party, it was the woman's eyes that lingered most in his memory. They were so piercing and timeless, filled with a profound sadness that felt out of place for someone so young. It was as though her eyes held the weight of countless years, something ancient and mysterious. Frank found himself grappling with an unsettling thought: could the woman with the striking blue eyes at the party be the same woman he had seen earlier that day in the park? The resemblance was striking, and though the two appeared quite different, one youthful and vibrant, the other dark and menacing, Frank couldn't shake the eerie feeling that they were connected. In the park, the young woman with the blue eyes had exuded an aura of loneliness and age that seemed incongruent with her youthful appearance. Now, recalling the woman from the party, the same unnerving sense of timelessness and coldness surfaced. The more he considered it, the more it seemed plausible that they might be one and the same. Frank struggled with this notion. The idea that two seemingly different women could be connected felt improbable. Yet, the eyes, those penetrating, almost ageless blue eyes, seemed to be the key. The familiarity was undeniable, a deep-seated recognition that he couldn't explain. The possibility that the woman from the park and the woman from the party were the same person was unsettling. He recalled the intense gaze of the park woman, her coldness, and the depth of her loneliness. The contrast with the party's chaos and danger only heightened his unease. Was it possible that the woman he had encountered in the park, who had seemed so lost and forlorn, was the same as the fearsome figure from the party? The disjointedness of the two personas only added to Frank's growing dread. It seemed improbable, yet the connection between those eyes suggested otherwise. As Frank watched the mesmerizing auroras streaking across the night sky, he felt a deep sense of foreboding. The radiant colors seemed to mock his confusion, their beauty contrasting sharply with the dark questions swirling in his mind. The more he tried to dismiss the idea, the stronger the feeling grew that there was a connection between the two women. The blue eyes, timeless, enigmatic, and filled with a sorrow that seemed to transcend ordinary human experience, were a puzzle Frank couldn't ignore. He knew he had to uncover the truth, but as the auroras continued their silent, colorful dance, he realized that the answers he sought were likely to be as elusive and complex as the strange phenomenon illuminating the sky. The next morning, Frank woke up feeling disoriented and slightly bewildered. He was surprised that he had managed to fall asleep at all, given the turmoil of the previous night. As he got out of bed and shuffled to the kitchen, the events of the party and the eerie blue-eyed woman continued to weigh heavily on his mind. In the kitchen, Frank mechanically prepared his breakfast. He began by slicing fresh fruit and adding it to a large bowl. He poured in some cereal and a generous amount of crunchy granola, followed by a splash of milk and a dollop of yogurt. As he mixed everything together, the rhythmic clinking of the spoon against the bowl was accompanied by the soft hum of the radio playing in the background. Good morning, listeners. This is Rebecca Stevens with your early news update. We're following the remarkable development of the rainbow phenomenon that began late last night. As of midnight, this extraordinary event has rapidly expanded across the globe. Reports indicate that the colorful auroras, which have been spreading with increasing speed, are predicted to envelop the entire planet within the next 24 hours. Scientists are baffled by the sudden acceleration of this phenomenon, and there are no clear explanations as to why it is occurring. Stay tuned for further updates as we continue to monitor this unprecedented event. Frank's mind raced as he listened. The news only amplified his sense of unease. The thought of the entire globe being covered by these mysterious auroras in such a short time added a new layer of urgency to his concerns. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was a deeper connection between the events of the previous night and the inexplicable spread of the rainbow phenomenon. With his breakfast prepared, Frank took a seat at the kitchen table, his thoughts still consumed by the strange occurrences and the unsettling familiarity of the woman with the blue eyes. The swirling colors of the auroras in the night sky seemed to be more than just a beautiful display, they felt like a harbinger of something significant, something he needed to understand before it was too late. Frank took a deep breath, trying to calm his racing thoughts as he continued to listen to the radio. The announcer's voice, though still tense, seemed to provide a brief respite from the immediate chaos of the previous night. And now, for the latest update, the announcer said, her voice wavering slightly, we have some startling news. The notorious criminal known as Raven, or Rob, as he was called, has been found dead. Raven was infamous throughout New York for his brutal criminal activities, and his death has sent shockwaves through the city. Frank's interest was piqued. Raven's name was one he knew well from news reports and urban legends. The announcer continued, her voice becoming increasingly nervous. What makes this particularly disturbing, she said, is that Raven's death is being attributed to the enigmatic organization known as Twilight. As you may know, Twilight has a reputation for dealing with their enemies in a way that leaves no trace. This time, however, they've acted with unusual public visibility. The announcer's anxiety was palpable. She took a moment to clear her throat before continuing, her tone tinged with fear. I just want to make it absolutely clear, she said, her voice trembling slightly, that I have nothing to do with these events. I'm just doing my job here, reading the news. Please, understand that I'm only the messenger, and I have no connection to Twilight or anything they're involved in. Frank noticed the tremor in her voice and the anxiety in her words. It was clear that even the news anchor was aware of the ominous reputation of Twilight and was concerned for her own safety. The fact that she seemed so worried made Frank realize that Twilight's notoriety extended beyond the criminal underworld he had imagined. It was affecting ordinary people as well, including those who simply reported the news. The news of Raven's death, combined with the fear expressed by the announcer, deepened Frank's unease. He had initially believed that Twilight was known only within the realms of organized crime. But it was becoming evident that their influence and fear stretched far wider than he had assumed. The realization that even people outside of the criminal circles were aware of Twilight and their terrifying reputation was unsettling. Frank's thoughts swirled as he finished his breakfast, his mind consumed by the growing connection between the bizarre rainbow phenomenon, the disturbing events of the previous night, and the chilling news about Twilight. After finishing his breakfast, Frank methodically cleaned up the kitchen, putting away the dishes and wiping down the counters. He was trying to maintain a sense of normalcy, though his mind kept drifting back to the strange events of the past day. Once everything was in order, he headed to his bedroom to get dressed for work, choosing his usual attire, hoping that routine might help calm his nerves. As he was about to leave his apartment, he paused by the window for one last look outside. The rainbow-colored auroras still dominated the sky, moving and shifting in mesmerizing patterns. The entire horizon was filled with these lights, which pulsed and swirled as if alive. The colors were stunning, but there was something deeply unsettling about their constant movement, as if the sky itself was restless. Stepping out into the street, Frank was immediately struck by the murmur of voices around him. It seemed like everyone was talking about the rainbow lights. As he made his way to work, he overheard snippets of conversation, each more varied than the last. One group was discussing the lights as if they were simply another weather anomaly. "It's just like those northern lights," a woman said confidently. "Probably something to do with solar activity, or maybe even the climate change we've been hearing so much about." As Frank neared his workplace, he overheard a couple, their voices hushed and anxious. "I think this is it," the woman whispered. "The end times, the judgment day. The world's not going to survive this." Her partner nodded solemnly. "We need to prepare. The signs are all there, this is the beginning of the end." Frank couldn't help but feel a shiver run down his spine at their words. The idea that these lights could be an omen of something catastrophic was frightening, but it also seemed too surreal to be true. By the time lunch came around, he was feeling more on edge than ever. He decided to head out for a walk, hoping that some fresh air might clear his head. But as he left the office, he noticed something even more troubling. A group of people was frantically shopping, their carts overflowing with groceries, bottled water, and other supplies. They were clearly preparing for something, and the sight of them only deepened Frank's sense of unease. The idea of mass panic setting in due to the mysterious lights and the unsettling events surrounding them made Frank uneasy. He knew that such panic could lead to chaos, shortages, and even violence. As he watched the people hoarding supplies, a thought came to him, one he hadn't considered in years. His parents had been paranoid, convinced that the world was always on the brink of disaster. They had invested in a villa, secluded deep in a forest, nestled in a small valley far from New York. The villa was more than just a home, it was a fortress, equipped with advanced security systems and, most notably, a fully functional nuclear bunker beneath it. Frank had always thought his parents' fears were extreme, but now, with the growing uncertainty, he wondered if their foresight might have been a blessing. The thought of retreating to the villa crossed his mind. It was a place where he could be safe, isolated from whatever might come next. But the idea of leaving everything behind and surrendering to fear was also something he wasn't ready to embrace. As he turned back toward his office, Frank couldn't shake the feeling that the world was shifting in ways he couldn't fully understand. The rainbow lights still danced across the sky, an ever-present reminder that something extraordinary, and perhaps dangerous, was happening. And as the afternoon wore on, Frank found himself increasingly preoccupied with the decision he might soon have to make. To stay and face whatever was coming or to retreat to the safety of the villa, prepared for the worst. The rest of the afternoon was a blur for Frank, his mind racing with thoughts of the strange events unfolding around him. The idea of retreating to his family's villa lingered in the back of his mind, but for now, he decided to take more immediate action. He couldn't ignore the signs of panic he had witnessed earlier, the people stocking up on supplies as if preparing for a long siege. It might have been overkill, but Frank couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something that they all needed to be ready for. When he finally returned to his apartment, it was already dark outside. Frank felt a sense of grim satisfaction as he stacked his supplies neatly in the pantry. He wasn't sure what was going to happen next, but at least he wouldn't be caught off guard. After ensuring everything was in place, he allowed himself to relax for a moment, switching on the radio again as he sat by the window, watching the sky. The rainbow-colored auroras were still there, but as Frank watched, he noticed something different. The lights seemed to pulse, their hues intensifying for a brief moment before dimming again. It was as if the entire sky had flickered, a surge of brightness that washed over everything but didn't blind him. The sight was mesmerizing and unsettling all at once, and Frank felt a strange tension in the air, as though something monumental was about to happen. Then, the voice on the radio cut through his thoughts. "It is now midnight," the announcer said, her tone filled with a mixture of awe and trepidation. "Reports are coming in from around the globe that the rainbow-colored auroras have now fully encircled the Earth. The entire planet is now shrouded in these mysterious lights." Frank's heart skipped a beat as he absorbed her words. The auroras had reached their peak, blanketing the world in their otherworldly glow. He felt a mix of fear and fascination. What did this mean for them all? He couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something far greater than anyone had anticipated. As he stared at the shifting, shimmering lights, he felt a deep unease settle into his bones. The colors were beautiful, but there was an underlying sense of dread, as though the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for whatever would come next. The scene shifted to a grand hall, opulent and imposing. The air hummed with an otherworldly energy as a cube-like portal appeared, its edges glowing with a soft blue light. The interior of the portal was filled with swirling mist, and its surface shimmered like a soap bubble, reflecting the colors of the rainbow auroras that blanketed the earth. From within the portal, a woman stepped forward, blonde hair, blue eyes, and a confidence that matched the luxurious surroundings. She moved with the grace of someone who was used to power, completely unfazed by the grandeur around her. Behind her, another figure emerged from the same portal, her assistant, the one with the two pistols, who followed her every move with a mixture of deference and silent efficiency. The hall they entered was a throne room, vast and adorned with gold and rich fabrics. At the far end, sitting on a high throne, was a man dressed in a purple suit, trimmed with golden designs. His eyes were a striking shade of violet, glowing faintly as they settled on the newcomers. Though his face was lined with age and his features sharp, his hair was as black as the night, and his presence exuded an aura of raw, commanding power. But the blonde woman was undeterred. She walked forward with calm assurance, her eyes meeting his with no hint of fear or hesitation. "Majesty," she greeted him, her tone respectful yet devoid of subservience. Her assistant, however, immediately dropped to one knee, bowing her head low in reverence. "Your Majesty," she said, her voice filled with reverence and fear. The man on the throne observed them with a cold, calculating gaze, the corners of his mouth twitching into the faintest hint of a smile. He radiated authority, a force that seemed to make the very air around him hum with tension. Yet the woman remained composed, as if she had stood before him 100 times before and knew that she had nothing to fear. "Welcome back," the man said, his voice deep and resonant, filling the hall. His gaze lingered on the blonde woman, curiosity flickering in his violet eyes. "It seems you have something to report." The woman nodded, her expression unreadable. "Indeed, Your Majesty. The operation was a success. The message has been sent." The man's smile widened ever so slightly, a dangerous gleam in his eyes. "Good," he murmured, his voice like velvet laced with steel. "Very good." The king on the throne, his violet eyes gleaming with subtle amusement, leaned back slightly as he regarded the two women before him. "Wanderer," he addressed the blonde woman, his tone carrying a note of familiarity, "and Lara, my daughter." His gaze softened momentarily as it settled on the younger woman kneeling before him. "You've done well." "Thank you, Your Majesty," Lara replied, keeping her head bowed. Though she was his daughter, she always referred to him with utmost respect, mindful of the traditions of their people. The Wanderer, with her relaxed demeanor, stepped closer to him, her presence commanding the same respect that filled the room whenever the king spoke. She placed a hand lightly on his shoulder as he turned away from the throne and began walking towards the large window overlooking the grand expanse outside. "I wanted to see an old friend," she said softly, her voice carrying a warmth that contrasted with the cold, calculating aura that often surrounded the throne room. The king paused for a moment, his eyes narrowing slightly as if pondering her words, then he let out a quiet chuckle. "It's been too long, hasn't it?" he remarked, his tone more personal now, the formalities slipping away in the presence of the Wanderer's familiar touch. Together, they reached the window, and the king's gaze drifted beyond the massive walls of the throne room. Before them lay a breathtaking view of a distant island, its shores lined with immaculate white buildings made of marble and adorned with gold. The structures gleamed under the strange, shifting light of the rainbow-colored auroras that filled the sky. An electric charge seemed to hang in the air, a tangible reminder of the power that flowed through this place. The wanderer's eyes scanned the landscape, taking in the pristine beauty of the island with a calm, almost detached expression. Yet, beneath that calm exterior was an understanding, a knowledge that few others possessed. The inhabitants seem unbothered by the lights, she observed, noticing how they went about their lives with a quiet confidence, barely glancing at the sky. But that's to be expected, said the wanderer, her voice calm as she pointed to the sky. Look, it's starting, Nikrian. The rainbow-colored auroras in the sky began to pulse, and a change was palpable in the air. Tiny, matte glowing raindrops in rainbow hues began to fall from the sky. These drops passed straight through any solid matter, but before they could touch anyone's skin, the wanderer observed that the raindrops curved away. It wasn't just her being avoided, everyone present in the room seemed to be circumvented by the droplets. Yes, it's beginning. The world will no longer be what it once was, Nikrian, the king of this place, stated solemnly. There are voices in the realm calling for us to seize control. What do you think, wanderer? Nikrian asked his old friend. The people won't dare to confront Twilight any longer, not that they'll have the time amidst the chaos that's coming, Lara, his daughter, added stiffly. Her eyes, timeless and deep, sparkled as she replied, it doesn't matter much. The people will weaken each other soon enough. The likelihood of civil wars and other conflicts in the coming times is very high. But I must make one thing clear. I didn't create this only to see it destroyed in a senseless war. I want to avoid being alone at all costs, said the wanderer, a tear rolling down her beautiful cheek. As she stood by the window, the wanderer appeared lonely and isolated. Nikrian took her into his arms, comforting her. I will do my best to ensure that this kingdom continues to exist, even if it's only to keep you from being alone in this world. And that was the end of today's story. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please like and subscribe. Don't forget to recommend it to your friends. If you want to hear more of this story, let me know in the comments and give it a thumbs up. I hope to see you in the next video. Until then, goodbye.